Yes.
So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Martin Coward. I am the lead editor at Review of International Studies. Review of International Studies is the oldest of the two British International Studies Association journals. We're about to turn 50 next year. We are a generalist journal. We cover the whole of the field of international relations. We interpret international politics very, very broadly. We like to try and kind of be global in scope. And one of the things we've been very interested in as a team is expanding the sort of boundaries of the debates that are happening in what we might call sort of mainstream international politics journals, starting new debates or making significant kind of contributions to ongoing debates. And it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to Giorgio and the LOC and Chrissy and BISA for organizing this. It's a real pleasure to kind of talk about this special issue. It's been a tough time with COVID, getting special issues sorted out, as I'm sure that Giorgio, Navnita and Tamara can tell you. But last December, we published this special issue. To my mind, it marks a really kind of significant kind of starting of a debate about the nature of relationality. There's been a lot of talk about kind of relational IR, but this really kind of pushes the debate on to think about the, if you like, the sort of the relationality of relationality, to kind of say that there's more than one type of relationality, and to kind of think plurally about the various types of relations that exist in international politics, broadly construed. And it covers ontology, methodology, things like Dharma and Confucianism, and indigenous thought as well. And so it's a huge kind of wide-ranging special issue, and I really recommend it to everybody. It's a kind of fantastic set of articles. So the structure for today is that Tamara Trounsell is going to start, and then Navnita Behar is going to go second, and Giorgio is going to go third. I can see that Jared Redekop and Amaya Karayazu are here. So we have a couple of other contributors who no doubt can speak to their pieces should they wish. And then afterwards, we'll have a kind of question and answer session. And I will do my best to chair an unruly 100-person Zoom call, which will test my limits of information technology skills. So I'll turn over to Tamara, and thank you very much for coming, all of you.
Thank you, Martin. Good day, evening, morning, night, depending on where you are. It fills my heart, first of all, to see everyone come together that we have available of the special issue and of the editorial board and LSE. This is a very touching moment to actually see that we have the special issue. It came together, it materialized, it's published, it's out. This has been a very long process, and I'm so grateful to see all the different names that come from throughout the world. So we are really grateful that you're here to be with us for this conversation. I wanted just to talk, I'm not going to be the one talking about pluriversal relationality. I'm going to just introduce a little bit about who we are, what do we have in common, what do we propose, and how do we do this. But the major thing that I'd like to call our attention to is that the whole effort of this special issue and of the whole process that was emergent throughout and allowed us to really make this special issue come together was this conversation about how do we take into consideration these other lived realities that also affect world politics, right? And how do we make space for conversing about them, but not just how do we come up with a new methodology to grasp or to generate knowledge in a particular way, but how can we sit in the tension with the complications that we're either living or seeing in the field, and really struggling to see how we can put this on paper or electronically and make it speak to the international relations discipline. And I think most of the people that are here are probably asking many of the same questions that we are. And so one of the very first things that I'd like to point out is that this is an invitation to conversation. This is an invitation to making the space and holding a space for a lot of different approaches. We're not trying to be, there's only one way of talking about relationality, or there's only one way of looking at international relations. What we're just trying to do is create the space to say, hey, if you don't make these assumptions about how the world exists, then you're not necessarily going to come up with the same kind of understanding of the world, right? And this is what we're trying to bring out. And so the entire special issue really seeks to take different people's lived experiences and contrast them even within what's called relationality. Like we're trying to actually push these relational boundaries and see where we can take them, and see what they afford and what they don't afford, right? And see how they contrast with our more predominant ways of understanding international relations. So I'm going to I just want to share two screens or two slides. Hopefully I can figure this out. I had to quickly switch computers before. Okay. So what you can see, obviously, is the front cover of the special issue, the title of the special issue. This Doing IR Differently is sort of the culmination of this collective. And fortunately, it was due to a lot of people's efforts. And thank you, Navneeta, for organizing the workshop back in 2016 in Delhi called The Alternative to Cosmologies and Knowledge Systems International Relations. And that gave the impetus for having another meeting in 2019 in the Galapagos Islands. And we basically, what these encounters did was allow us to sit, coming from different parts of the world, to ask each other, okay, what do the forms of reductionism that we're facing when we try to do our research, coming from different parts of the world, how do these forms of reductionism show a pattern? What's the pattern that we're seeing? Or what are the root causes of the fact that we are trying to express something, but consistently it keeps getting cut short? And so it was very interesting through this process. Clearly not everybody that's on, and I'm hopefully going to get to, there we go. Everybody that ended up in the special issue were not part of these two other processes. But it was a great culmination of us trying to open ourselves up to different relational ways of talking, right? And so Milia's, well, I'll just go through maybe so we can see a little bit more. Our introduction is talking about how we need to have new ways of talking about the world, talking about the universe, and seeing the implications of making different existential assumptions, and how that gives us a different shape of understanding what we're relating to, who we're relating to, and how we're relating to them. And pluriversality, Navneeta will get to, but it's a really important concept coming out of the Andean philosophy. And one of the things from my article called Recrafting Ontology, after spending 16 years in Ecuador really studying these, what you start to realize is how we can have a multiverse, a pluriverse of many different ways of engaging with the cosmos. And this has a lot of different implications for how we understand who we are and what we're how we understand a political situation, right? Media Kirky coming more, her relationality stemming more from the new conversations that she's been trying to have. Her piece is actually more introductory in terms of how we've understood relationality within international relations up until now. And so she's really pushing for this enmeshment concept. Then we move to Giorgio Shani and Navneeta Behera's piece on provincializing international relations. They really develop the notion of dur and how we can get from dur to an understanding of dharma as a bigger piece, and what that means for how we understand relations of self to other, of self-self, of really breaking apart these understandings of how we relate to one another and what the implications are. Jared Redekop's piece on ontological capture, and I'm assuming that both Giorgio and Navneeta and Jared and Amaya will be able to speak a little bit more to their pieces. He really develops more the concept of runa and how this compares to the more Western understanding of human being. And as he develops in parallel these two different concepts, you can really see how a more skeletal approach to human being without a very big, robust relational understanding of self gets lost when we try to understand runa as human being only. And similarly with Amaya Kerehasu, with the notion of cosmopraxis, what we see is that she's trying to show that we are not just thinking, we are relating, being, sensing, and that all of these activities that we're doing is a form of cosmopraxis, which actually, it's the foundation of how I call co-creation. Cosmopraxis is how we're constantly creating together. And as we create together, how this has implications for the relations that we build with each other. Second to last, Morgan Brigg, Mary Graham, and Martin Weber's piece on relational indigenous systems from Aboriginal Australian political orders. The really great thing about this article is that they demonstrate how indigenous conceptualizations of political order are not new, but that when you start from a relational perspective, they have very different implications for how political order is understood. And bringing this to the fore, to be able to see that our way of just assuming order and politics is not the only way. And they're really trying to bring about greater understanding of the duration with which there has been political order in Aboriginal systems of being and relating. Finally, with Chiyushi's piece of role and relation in Confucian IR, Chiyu does a great experiment in talking about role theory and how we can use Confucian notions of role theory to re-understand relations with China and others in the world. And so it's interesting when you look at finally the final product that's published, just being able to see the vastness or the breadth of experiences that are being included to try to talk about relationality from many different perspectives is very helpful to say or to show that we're not all talking about the same relationality, and that once we get into looking at what does this mean when we relate it to more neo-positive approaches or more predominant ways of understanding, it's very helpful to give us greater tools and vocabulary and language so that we can become more aware of the ways in which just our assumptions about existence make available certain ways of imagining existence and cut off other ways of imagining existence. And that by giving shape to the realm of imaginable possibilities, that really affects what we're able to know and how we're able to engage. And with that, I would like to pass over to Navneeta, a greater discussion of what we're trying to do with this pluriversal notion of relationality. Thank you.
Martin, may I come in? Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Yes, please do, please do.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, LSC, and everybody who's present today. This is, as Tamara just explained, truly been a labor of love, almost 6 years of work coming to a certain fruition. So good to see it reaching this point. I will kind of try and pick up the pieces from where Tamara left off. One point that, Martin said in the beginning, and Tamara also mentioned, I just wanted to flag it quickly, is that there has been a lot of work on relationality in international relations. So when we use the term pluriversal relationality, how is it that we are trying to be supposedly different? What is it that we are putting out in terms of our argument? And I'm speaking collectively in terms of the findings or in terms of the insights that all the scholars, contributors to the special issue are putting it out together. So it's not individually my thoughts. I'm kind of speaking for all of them put together. I've learned a lot in this journey. And I think the three critical points is that we take relationality not just as a way of knowledge creation. It's like it's more like a way of practicing existence, where your sort of the boundaries between, there are no boundaries between knowing, being, and becoming. What you know is what you are and what you're becoming. So it's a question of practicing what you know. And there are no separate boundaries between that. And second is in terms of, again, we are not only talking about humans and non-humans and cosmos, we are seeing all of them, the humans and non-humans in the cosmos, in a relational ways of looking at the world. So that's kind of one way we wanted to expand the boundaries of what is it that we are including. And the third one is that it's like intrinsically plural. You would have gotten an idea by now what Tamara talked about, that it's basically multitude of expressions grounded in several cosmological traditions. And I think that's what my own personal recollection of Ecuador is about, that in a room full of people, I learned a lot. As an Indian, I did not know how much I could share with Indian philosophy, about which I was learning for the first time. And yet there was so much to relate to in that sense. So there are several cosmological traditions that speak to the idea of rationality that we are talking about in the special issue. But basically, I'm going to try and focusing on that. What is the idea that the special issue puts out in terms of what is a pluriversal IR? What's a vision out there? And the core idea of the vision is that we are holding this promise of finally sort of recognizing the coexistence of these diverse cosmological, ontological traditions, and sort of way of creating a space, as Tamara put it, which allows these political negotiations to allow these realities to exist on their own terms. I think that's what we are talking about, that there are different political realities and they should be allowed to speak on their own terms, and they should be just one way of knowing the world, so to say. So we began by asking some very fundamental questions again, like what are our modes of knowing? Is it only reason, logic, sensory perception, energetic ways of knowing, or who knows, or who can know? Because we've known, based on historically, if you were to look at based on gender, class, race, several other criteria, that there were, only certain people can know or know better, so to say. And we are wanting to expand the boundaries, not just to all humans, but also to non-humans out there. And how do we understand time? That's something that I found very interesting, because everybody's understanding of time is by default more linear. But if I were to look at my own Indian tradition, this like cyclical. Time is a cyclical phenomenon. So how do we understand time as a linear, cyclical, both? Are there other ways out there that we don't know about? And where do we locate ourselves? Is it like one world, or world is actually made of multiple universes, as Tamara called it, pluriverse? And most importantly, I think IR is a lot about understanding difference. So is the difference a puzzle? Is it something to be managed or eliminated, or it's basically to be acknowledged as a necessary ingredient of existence? So, and what I think a collective exercise, what we did was that if we were to ask these questions from ourselves, what we found was some answers were kind of excluded or marginalized or silenced over histories, and some have become almost like commonsensical understandings. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave the discipline of IR? And where do we go from here? And if we were to ask that question in terms of, opening up new trajectories of inquiries, we lay out three of them. Again, it's like different papers address different elements of these three sets. First one is what we're talking about, uncovering IR's silence pasts. And To this, I'm referring to both ontological, cosmological, historical realities. What we're asking is that we really need to sort of revisit and re-examine some of the fundamental existential commitments that we've made, and this very violent and somewhat exploitative historical relationship. You can call it East and West, or North and South, or Occident and Orient, which have long been erased. So we do find a lot of synergy with the decolonial, approaches, or decolonial ways of doing IR in that sense. The whole argument that we are trying to make is that IR, as it has evolved historically, has excluded or precluded, acknowledging many other possibilities, legitimate existential possibilities that could be derived from relational ways, life worlds of living cultures across the world. Something that the rational approaches we find sorely ill-equipped to understand, almost unable. And we are speaking ourselves to not just the rational approaches, but also some of the relational approaches, which take, which don't take an ontological assumption of interconnection as the starting point of inquiry. Because what we find is that the existing relational approaches sometimes take separation as the fundamental condition of existence, and as and when they do that, they do sort of exclude certain possibilities from emerging. And the question we are asking is that if we were to take interconnection as our fundamental ontological assumption, the very meaning of ontology actually undergoes a change, which is what Tamara talks about in her paper in terms of recrafting the ontology. So the one thirst of paper where all authors come together is that we are all trying to find different ways to sort of surmount this ontological parochialism, what we call. The idea is, how do we learn to become ontological plural? And we go at the base of the term ontology itself. And the idea at this point of time is that we need to understand as to how these separation-based ontological assumptions somehow became naturalized, and they became the normative order of thought, and what were the conceptual devices that were deployed to privilege these, to suppress other fundamental existing commitments, to a point where this ontological plural, the parochialism is the default mode. We don't even problematize it sufficiently enough, and we don't quite actually realize as to how much are we losing out by not recognizing as to how exclusionary this has proven to be. There are several papers who speak to this. I will let Jared and Maya and maybe Giorgio and me can come in at some point of time, but keeping in mind that time, let me just go on to the next point. What we're talking about is recasting difference, which is basically unsettling hierarchies, because there are, the whole problem of ontological difference, which is shaped the meta theory of IR, historically and politically. And the premise of understanding difference to our minds is basically in the rationalist or foundational IR is derived from this Cartesian dualism, which is one of the dominant traditions in the European philosophy, and which in turn is kind of influenced to some extent by Aristotle's this either or logic. The truth can be this or that, but it cannot be both. But that's what actually different cosmological traditions around the world contest, because they would say that truth can be this and that, and it does not has to be either or. And that is something that my paper with Giorgio, when we talk about the dharmic cosmology, that speaks to it, that truth is not unilinear, nor is this susceptible to this either or mode of knowing, so to say. Truth implies untruth in itself. And we are familiar with a lot of Chinese scholars, for example, who've worked on relational IR, whether it's to do with the Tianxia cosmology or whether it is to do with the Chinese dialectics of Xinzang. They both look at both and logic, in the sense you're talking about simultaneously of self-existence, other existence, coexistence. They all happen simultaneously. And I'm sure Amaya would talk about, from the Indian traditions, when she talks about cosmopraxis, similar argument, that the both and logic work. It does not, life is not understood in terms of either it can be this or it can be that. So what we are wanting to do is basically, can we understand difference in a non-hierarchical way? That is the main challenge that we have. That difference does not has to be cast necessarily in hierarchical sense. They can be different ways of understanding self and other. Jared, I'm sure, would talk about, the whole idea of self becomes very porous, very plural, when he talks about Kichwa selfhood. And other, Morgan and others paper also, they talk about, when they're talking about Aboriginal communities in Australia, as to how different logics and different understandings operate, and they're all equally legitimate and equally valid. So the idea is basically not to understand ontology as we tend to do that in international relations, and which some of the contributors term as an atomistic ontology, which is basically based on the principle of separation. What we're saying is, if you were to take the base principle of interconnection, world looks differently. And what is it that we can do to actually engage with this world, which actually is lived realities of billions of people across the world? And the last part that we talk about, many scholars, contributors in the paper talks about this relational ways of knowing and being. And that is basically what we're trying to say, is that is how people live across different parts of the world. So to begin with, we just need to cultivate a sense of awareness of the relatedness of beings, and how the universe sort of needs to recast our modes of inquiry, recast our ways of knowing the world, and sort of overcoming these familiar dichotomies of objectivity and subjectivity, and facts and values, and reason and belief, and so on and so forth. The idea is that we don't want to subject ourselves to these binaries, and there are many others before us who have actually also questioned these binaries, but we are just kind of trying to introduce or taking it to a deeper level, if I may say so. Relational cosmologies, unlike, for example, both the conventional and critical IR, what we are trying to do is that we are not trying to privilege any one mode of inquiry over other. This is a space which we are trying to open up for a conversation across different modes of inquiry, across different ways of knowing. It was fascinating, for example, when we were talking to some African scholars, they talked about Ubuntu tradition. It was simply I am, we, I am because we are because I am. Again, there is no distinction, binary between the self and other. The Mayan tradition was I speak, you listen. And the Kichwa tradition that Jared talks about is again that there are different gradients of even relatedness, there's no singular notion of relationality and sort of a separation. So basically, it's like IR has gone through its journey of theoretical methodological changes to diversify the foundational knowledge basis of IR. What we are trying to say is, what we have yet to learn is how to become ontologically plural. How do we learn the tools, which we are still in the process of evolving? That's why we call it a work in progress. But what is it that would allow us to understand that different people in different parts of the world are operating from different existential assumptions? And how can we understand how they work, how they think, without understanding their foundational assumptions in which their life practices are rooted in? That's basically what the message of the special issue is. I'm sorry I overshot. Thank you, Giorgio, and thank you, Martin.
Fantastic, Navneeta. Thank you very much. Giorgio, would you like to speak now? And Jared and Amaya, if you have kind of something you want to kind of add, maybe you could come in after Giorgio or something like that.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin. If I could just follow up by thanking Navneeta and Tammy, not only for their presentations, but for inviting me to join the editorial team. I have a very short PowerPoint, which I'd like to show. It's not necessary, but I'd like to start firstly by thanking the LSE and Katie in particular for supporting this request for co-hosting this virtual launch. I'd like to thank Martin for walking us through and for his support for the special issue, and Chrissy in particular, and Juliet and Katie at BISA for organizing it and for publicizing it. So thank you very much. This is a wonderful opportunity for all of us. Before I show the PowerPoint, I just want to underscore one of the central points which Navneeta and also Tammy have made, which is the radical disjuncture between the concepts and categories which we learn in international relations and the lives of not only our students, but our own lives. If we don't share the same cosmological assumptions or existential assumptions as those who contributed to the discipline of international relations, these concepts, categories such as the state, such as the nation, even such as if we look at sociology, class, etc., these appear alien and need to be translated into different cosmological registers. So basically, all we're doing in this special issue is to try and create space for a conversation between different meta-theoretical or existential, I would call them cosmological concepts, which could potentially help structure a more arguably inclusive conversation on what international relations will be. We are not trying to use the words of the contribution by Morgan, Mary and Martin, we're not trying to sort of escape by ontology. We're not positing an alternative international relations. This is the task of critical theorizing in international relations. All we're trying to do is to bring into the conversation these different cosmological relational traditions which have been occluded from the conversation and not brought into the conversation. So that, in a nutshell, is basically what the special issue really is about. If I could just share the screen and go through basically the main ideas which we developed. As Tammy mentioned, the rationale is what happens for the special issue. What happens if we conceive of international relations from a relational perspective, and how can we pluralize the sources of relational thinking in IR? Now, I'm aware that we've used a lot of terms which may be familiar to the majority of you, but to some of you, you may not be familiar with these terms. So perhaps we can try and unpack them. So by relationality, we're really referring to relations, the idea that relations are prior to and constitutive of entities or things. Now, relationality is probably not the right word we want to use. We want to look at relations per se, but encompassed within relationality is this idea that relations are basically there before we can talk of things or units. And this is at the very heart of our engagement within international relations. People talk in terms of a relational term, and we're attempting to pluralize this relational term by bringing in these different traditions. Now, I've used the term cosmological. Jared, and who'll speak after me, and also Tammy talk more in terms of ontological traditions rather than cosmological. by cosmologies, and I think Milia Kirky also uses cosmology in a more scientific conception. All we mean are narratives about the origins and evolution of the cosmos and our place in it. So the idea is that these cosmological assumptions shape our understanding in relation to others and shape our understanding in relations to the world of international relations. Now, we have talked about the pluriversal, and Navneeta has defined an understanding of the pluriversal. By pluriverse, and this is used by many, not only within the special issue, but within international relations. It's part of a decolonial approach, which has its origins in the work of Walter Mignolo and Arturo Escobar and others. We're talking about, instead of living in one universe, we live in a pluriverse of multiple entangled universes. So if we look at pluriversal relationality, we're conceiving of relationality as ways of practicing existence. Thus, relational approaches unravel the division between what Navneeta mentioned, being, knowing, and doing. Pluriversal relationality is multidimensional in that it sees humans, non-humans, and the cosmos in relational frames. It breaks down the privileged category of the human, which is associated very much with Enlightenment rationality and the development of modernity. And it is intrinsically plural with multitudinal expressions grounded in diverse, I'm using the term cosmological traditions, but we can talk in terms of ontological traditions. In order to summarize the entire special issue, what we're trying to do is show how these different ontological or cosmological traditions in the Americas, Asia, and Australia view and practice relationality. By that, we mean relate to others and the cosmos. An engagement, it tries to give an engagement with these relational traditions and the conception of space, time, self-other relations, selfhood, praxis, and political and social order. So at the very least, international relations could be less, to quote Tammy in her presentation and her article, less ontologically parochial. And this opens up the possibility of forging a pluriversal research agenda for IR. So we're not pushing this agenda, we're just opening up a potential possibility for it, based on uncovering what Navneeta mentioned, IR's silent pasts, unsettling hierarchies, and examining relational ways of knowing and being. Now, we conclude, and I'm aware that this talk or this conversation also speaks to, or poses a question, doing IR differently. This is an open question. Are we doing IR differently? And I think one of the ways in which we conclude the special issue is to look at the problems of bringing in different traditions and understanding them in their own terms. And that's what we're really trying to do. So the argument is that international relations needs to be understood from different ontological and cosmological registers in their own terms. How do we do so? This is an open question. In the Q&A, perhaps we can talk about the impact of colonial modernity. Navneeta and I work on post-Western international relations, so our understanding is that there is no pure indigenous tradition per se. These traditions have been impacted by colonial modernity. And this makes a conversation between fragments, between these cosmological fragments, the best we can hope for, but also imperative in order to have a more inclusive international relations. So the problem which different cosmological traditions face is the following quandary. If they're radically different from the dominant conception of ontology and international relations, they need to justify how it speaks to IR. And we see this also in some of the reviewers' comments and in some of the reception, which is, well, this is not IR, this is anthropology. This is political theory, perhaps, but it's not international relations. You're not dealing with the assumptions of international relations, which Navneeta and I argue in our article are actually based on assumptions from a particular cosmological tradition, here the Judeo-Christian tradition. On the other hand, if we do add in different cosmological traditions as case studies, they are not understood in their own terms, and they may not even be heard. Spivak's wonderful treatise, which people basically, or essay, which people I think take a bit too literally within post-colonial studies, posing the question on whether the subaltern can speak. She's ambivalent on this. But in a lot of the literature, there's an assumption that the other, whoever the other is, cannot speak without using the language here of the colonizer. And if we try and seek new ground, we try and use for relational, let's say, relationality or the relational turn in international relations as an entry point, there's always the danger of assimilation. There's always the danger of it being incorporated into international relations, and it becomes like an exotic illustration of ideas which others have come up with before. So basically, in order to seek a common ground, they need to explain what's new, what's original here. So this is really the quandary which we're dealing with. And hopefully this conversation will allow us to think through the possibilities of engaging with these cosmological fragments in their own terms. Now, I don't wish to go through Navneeta and my article. I'll share the link with you later, but I do want to thank firstly the different contributors to the special issue. And I'd like to bring in Jared and Amaya. Their articles directly follow Navneeta's and mine. And I think they have a lot to say with this issue of how to engage with different ontological or cosmological traditions in their own terms by talking about ontological capture, the danger of ontological capture, and the possibilities opened by cosmopraxis. So thank you very much. I'll stop there and pass over to Jared. Thank you.
Fantastic. Jared, Amaya, just before you say something briefly, can I just say to everybody on the call, you can either put comments in the chat. I see AJ's said something there precisely about sort of this kind of question of ontological capture or taking cosmologies on their own terms. You can put questions in the chat, or you can raise your hands, and then as soon as Jared and Amaya have said something, we'll be able to kind of take those. So start thinking, start getting in the queue.
Perfect.
Jared.
Yeah, well, thank you, Martin, and I'd like to thank Giorgio and Navneeta and Tamara for the introduction, which makes it really easy to come in and add some things after a lot of heavy lifting has been done. So I guess I'll keep this brief to leave time for others and for conversation. But to add just sort of a few points kind of in relation to that, I guess to speak to my piece, we could probably see sort of three main layers, I guess, at least in what I'm trying to do there. And so the first of these is really to think about and think through the implications of relational thinking as I've come to think alongside that and with that and learn about that in relation with indigenous American traditions of thought. So mainly that's Amazonian Quechua thinking, but then I also bring in and try to put that into dialogue as well with some North American indigenous traditions, Anishinaabe and so on. So part of what I'm trying to do there is think through the ways in which relational thinking coming from that kind of context opens a different way of understanding the cosmos and ourselves in the cosmos. And also, I mean, to touch on this piece that Giorgio mentioned, insofar as when one is called upon to sort of speak to how what you're doing relates to IR in some sense. I tried to frame this kind of broadly in terms of the problem of say, what is it to relate with others across boundaries of difference? And so I wanted to think through how Quechua thinking, for example, might invite one to think about that. And so I kind of ground my discussion in origin stories, which tell about a process through which at early times and beginning times, everyone was human, and then different transformations happen that then give rise to the different species. And so when Tamara is talking about the difference between Runa and human being in human being, as we think about it coming out of the sort of Euro-Western tradition and so on, versus Runa in the Quechua tradition, that's thinking about Runa. It means human, but it doesn't just mean human in the sort of species sense that we think about it in the Western tradition, but rather, trees and animals and plants and so like that, they're all transformed Runa. And so that opens a different kind of horizon of interaction. And so part of what I try and think about in that regard is how, if the problem is how does one relate with others across boundaries of difference, how does that then compose a certain kind of international space? That's something that we really need to first of all situate in terms of relationships across species boundaries, and thus with the land and so on. The second layer I'm trying to do then is to sort of enfold some of that thinking in a broader reflection as well on my own kind of implicatedness and my own ability to write on this and to think about these kinds of questions. So, I mean, I come to these traditions from the outside. I'm a Euro-descended Canadian, et cetera. And so part of what I wanted to do was to blend in those reflections with some others that speak to the ways in which someone like myself is actually enfolded in these political orders and legal orders and so on that are premised on indigenous ways of thinking about relationality in the place that I live. And so the mechanism for that being something like treaty. And so I try and pose this in part as how might the provocations and the and so on of relational indigenous thinking to Western thought and the kind of openings that allows for, how might that kind of critical philosophical work and so forth be a part of the ways in which someone like me is actually sort of called upon, interpolated into indigenous political orders through treaty? What is it then to hold up my end of treaty as a kind of method of relating in some sense? So then the third point and what I try and do is then to speak about and do a little bit of thinking about the ways in which those kinds of, I think, transformative or alternate horizons of relating, thinking about normative possibilities and so on, tend to get covered over through a mechanism of what I call ontological capture. So the ways in which indigenous relational thinking, for instance, gets then integrated into the ontological assumptions and categories and so forth of Western thought, and thereby, we miss so many of these kinds of provocations to thinking and being differently from all kinds of different positionalities, mine included. Yeah, so maybe I'll just leave it there, but that gives kind of an overview of the different moments and what I'm trying to do.
Fantastic, thank you. Amaya, do you have something to add?
Yeah, thank you. I'll be very brief. I want also to thank Navneeta, Tamara, and Giorgio for editing this special issue, and Martin and Reese for making this conversation possible, and today to BISA and LSE to have this gathering. So what I basically want to refer to is that the concern that I had when I wrote this paper was that I was convinced that relationality offers an alternative way of thinking, of being, and of thinking of IR that is very important to have in mind. But there was also the concern that the more we talked about relationality, the more we thought this is important, this is something to take seriously, the more it became a thing. And as a thing that it was becoming, it was growing as an opposite thing to the atomistic ontology. So we were kind of going into the dangers or the setbacks or the pitfall that is, okay, how to do relationality without becoming what we criticize that the atomistic world does, that is create things and entities and put a reality where they operate as an opposite. So for me, this was a very concerning thing. And on the other hand, I was in the situation that Giorgio described and Navnita described, that once you engage with relationality is very difficult to go back and use traditional methodologies or methods to try to do research. And so you need another different framework or mindset to just keep doing this conversation or contributing this conversation without reifying relationality. So in the text, what I propose is that instead of the what of relationality, what happens if we focus or stress or highlight the how of relationality, which means how do these relations actually relate? And how do these connections and co-becoming and becomings actually provide with tools to thinking of IR and doing IR differently. So that is how I come to the notion of cosmopraxis, which is a notion that anthropologists use to describe how locals in the Andes describe their own engagement with the world. And this cosmopraxis basically refers to the relationality of the process of thinking and being and knowing and feeling, not as a separate experience, but as an experience that happens in a simultaneous moment. So we create reality as we know it and as we practice life. So being aware that this can be a very kind of complex, I don't know, notion or concept, what I wanted to do is that, okay, because we need different methods and we need a different path, what I do is to offer kind of a way of thinking of or providing with methods. I call them methods, but I think that they are more paths or connectors that are common not only to human as a species, but also to the other non-human. And these methods of engaging life is like storytelling, textiling or embroidery, cooking, dancing, and even dreaming. And these paths are ways of actually understanding what cosmopraxis is about and how do you actually are able to travel time, go to the past and the future without moving, because everybody knows or has experienced the fact that if you tried, I don't know, something that your grandmother used to cook, then you transport yourself to when you were a child. So I kind of play with this kind of paths and to illustrate that these are everyday practices that we engage to. And this is part of how we create reality and create together, as Tamara was saying. And in this creative process, life extends not only to our individual way of doing, but also what we create becomes an agent on its own. So that allows to have the conversation with the non-human and having a political agency and so. But that's what I propose in the text, and I'll leave it there so that we have time for questions.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Really rich set of reflections about well, about all of the kind of themes of the special issue.